Hello everyone, I'm Andrew Wilson. Welcome to Lecture 6 in the series Russia's War Against Ukraine. This week our theme is the Ukrainian idea. Russians tend to talk about Project Ukraine, by which they mean artificiality of Ukraine. Whereas Ukrainians prefer the term Ukrainian idea, the subjective reality of identifying with a nation. So Putin talks about Ukraine as the anti-Russia, by which he means something very specific, that Ukraine is an artificial state and the tool of Western powers. But Ukrainians are happy with the label so long as it means embracing values that are different to Russia's. What are they? Well, first of all, Ukraine increasingly defines itself as a post-colonial country. This wasn't always the case, but in the three revolutions that Ukraine has had since independence in 1991, each has been more explicitly anti-colonial than the last. Elements were always there, even back in 1990, so-called revolution on granite, meaning the hard concrete ground in Kyiv central square, the Maidan, in the black and white photo. One of the demands was that Ukrainian soldiers shouldn't serve in the Russian Imperial Army, Soviet Imperial Army. But through the Orange Revolution, 2004, Revolution of Dignity, 2014, this emphasis on post-coloniality has been much more explicit. Second, statehood, not empire. Both the Declaration of Independence in 1991 and the Constitution of Ukraine 1996 refer to a 1,000-year tradition, ancient, of state building in Ukraine. Not empire building, but state building. Starting with Kyivan tradition. The adjective is very important in Ukrainian historiography. It means that original Rus 1,000 years ago was a normal, albeit medieval, European state with a balance of power between prince and nobility, with a nobles' assembly called the Vicha, with elements of a rule of law, so-called Ruska Pravda. Whereas Russian history is later in Ukrainian historiography. It begins in the 14th century, and it was a different tradition under Mongol and Byzantine influence, which became imperial and messianic, as opposed to the original Kyivan tradition, which in religion was much more ecumenical and not messianic, not based on the idea that Moscow was somehow the third Rome, all of which matured in the 17th century in the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which existed until 1686. Under this key figure, Petro Mahila, who was actually Moldovan. And the modern Orthodox Church of Ukraine sees itself as a revival of this tradition and a revival of its culture, which was influenced by Renaissance, Reformation and post-Reformation, much more than the Russian Church ever was. Ukraine is a land of natural agricultural abundance, idea encoded in the flag itself, blue sky over yellow corn. Ukraine, globally, if you look in green, has very high concentration of some of the world's best agricultural land. Freedom, in many ways, the most important in Ukrainian historiography. This shows the Maidan in central Kyiv. The trade union building burnt down, not quite to the ground, but this is it under repair with a big banner showing the breaking of change. Freedom is our religion, is the kind of post-Maidan slogan. Celebrated in this painting, Repin, the Zaporozhian Cossacks writing a mocking letter to the Turkish Sultan. Stalin may have liked this painting. allegedly his famous painting. But for Ukrainians, it's popular because it celebrates this idea of freedom. Here it is recreated by some soldiers in the current war, writing a mocking letter to Putin, presumably. The Ukrainian national anthem, here it is in Ukrainian, here it is in England, celebrates this idea of freedom. The word itself occurs multiple times, particularly because the last two lines are repeated twice. We will lay down our souls and bodies for our freedom, to show that we are, another trope, brothers of Cossack blood. That's another idea, fraternity, right? Ukrainians working and even fighting together. Even elements of a martial tradition. And here you see the last president, Petro Poroshenko, overseeing a revival of a revival, the reintroduction of these 1918 costumes in considerable measure, because there was this desire for two post-Soviet armies, Russian and Ukrainian, to actually look different when they were fighting. Related to the idea of freedom, the idea of democracy. Cossacks elected their leaders, or hetman. One of them, Pilip Orlik, produced a democratic constitution in 1710, before French Revolution, before the American Revolution. It wasn't actually used, but although it was never actually implemented, it's a kind of Enlightenment blueprint influenced by the likes of John Locke and others, much like the French and American revolutions were. There's even a cartoon series, popular cartoon series called Cossacks Who. They do everything in the Cossack style. It's kind of Ukrainian version of Asterix and Obelix. You've got these twin themes of freedom and fraternity all the time. Another related trope, the idea of contract, partly from Polish influence. In Poland, you had elected kings. The elective process involved what was called the Pacta Conventa, that you'd have an assembly of the Szlachta, the nobility, who would bargain over whom they would elect. These traditions, in adapted form, passed into how hetmen were elected in Ukraine. There was also in Ukraine Magdeburg law, the idea of contractual rights for citizens of cities. And this monument to Magdeburg law is on the banks of the river Dnipro in Kyiv. Magdeburg law existed on Ukrainian land until the early 19th century. Another trope, horizontal or self-organisation. In modern terms, civil society or NGOs. One of which, the Centre for Civil Liberties in Ukraine, does excellent work, was jointly awarded the Nobel Prize last year. So this is in sharp contrast to Russian Cossackdom. The Ukrainian Cossacks were basically escaping state authority, mainly the authority of the Polish state. Whereas Russian Cossacks were mainly the servants of state authority, both for pushing Russia's borders to the south, for controlling imperial territories, colonies, and in modern times, as servants of the state. In the second picture, modern Cossacks beating up protesters in Russia. So this is a very good book which tries to encapsulate these different political cultures. One based on ideas of empire and autocracy, and one based on Cossack ideas of self-organisation and freedom. Though, as Kuchma points out, not everything in this mix is simply good. Cossacks may be more demotic, more democratic, but they are prone to factionalism and to excess fragmentation, what Kuchma calls polyvassalage, loyalty to too many authorities. And because of this tendency to self-organise outside of state authority, a very fuzzy conception of what state authority actually might be. Things we've mentioned before, Lipinski and his idea of civic Ukrainian identity and freedom, hugely important, even embraced by President Leonid Kuchma, who wrote a very long book called Ukraine is Not Russia, which could be condensed to an argument in 2 sentences. Ukraine is not Russia because its political culture is different to Russia's. So in academic science, not an ethnic identity, not elements of shared culture, according to Antti Smith's definition, but as we talked about in lecture 5, this inclusive idea of all citizens, loyalty to the state or cives, based on myths of a civic nation, arguably formed by the multiple revolutions that Ukraine has had since 1991, and the Russo-Ukrainian War, which catalyzed, according to this author, the creation of a political nation. Or better, strengthened processes that were already ongoing. You can already see, for example, in this poll data from 2007 to 2015, so just after Russia's first invasion, this growing preference shift from the red elements of ethnic identity, having Ukrainian ancestors, to the yellow elements of civic nationalism, identity based on citizenship and where you live, and loyalty to the cives. Polling data shows big increases in this idea of an identity based primarily on being a national citizen. So in the 90s, early noughties, these kind of questions would produce much bigger answers in terms of those identifying with the first 2 options, residents of village, district or city in which you live, or residents of a particular region. Now that's now down sharply to about 6%, whereas numbers identifying with being a citizen of Ukraine up in 80s. Here you can see, although the words are in Ukrainian, I've translated them for you, the dynamic of civic identity of the population of Ukraine, how that has risen from about half to 84.6% by 2022. The Maidan revolution, or the Revolution of Dignity, 2013, 2014, embodied this civic idea. This is my picture taken on the 18th of February. It shows a human chain. Up the street are young men throwing the cobblestones at the police. But here you've got civic organisation, starting with a grandmother with her shopping at the bottom. So the whole community is uprooting the cobblestones, passing them along to be used in self-defence. 2 excellent books on the Revolution of Dignity, one by Marcy Shaw, one by Mikhailo Vinitsky, have emphasised what Vinitsky calls the civic aspects. The revolution had 3 dimensions. It was national. It was about the maturation of Ukrainian identity, throwing off imperial, colonial or post-colonial identity. It was about the emergence of new civic forces, civil society groups, a new middle class. But it was also about the idea of dignity, civic freedom, civic obligation, being treated and treating others with that key word, dignity. And about civic forms of organisation, not hierarchical, but horizontal or even heterarchical, multiple different forms of authority without traditional leaders or networks. 3 revolutions make Ukraine a land of protest and revolution, which is one key reason why Putin dislikes it so much. Starting with the wave of what were called coloured revolutions in the year 2000. Ukraine, 2004, the Orange Revolution. Georgia, 2003, the Rose Revolution. This graph, looking at the later period, 2009 to 2019, shows just how common revolution, often inspired by Ukraine, is in the whole of the post-Soviet space. Not just the 2 that happened, plus one in Kyrgyzstan in the noughties. And more recently, protest in Belarus, 3 months, August 2020. Navalny protests, albeit suppressed in both cases, in Russia in 2021. Ukraine is this land of revolution and protest. Another key theme, related theme, how the 1917 revolution and state building at the time is now remembered in Ukraine, particularly 2017, around 2017, the centenary. It's framed as the Battle of Two Revolutions, title of this Ukrainian language book. I.e., there was a Russian revolution, but there was also a Ukrainian revolution. The Russian revolution, the Bolshevik revolution, was about social class, whereas the Ukrainian one, framed as Nasha Revoluция, our revolution, was much more about nation building and escape from empire. And also, in this slogan from the centenary, this theme continues, framed as 100 years of struggle, the Ukrainian Revolution, 1917 to 1921. 100 years taking us to the present day. So a continuity in this struggle to establish freedom, democracy, statehood, despite the long period of Soviet rule in between. Modern Ukraine is the successor of the state traditions of the Ukrainian Revolution of 1917 to 1921. So this is unlike the Russian tradition, because it was an attempt to build a European state with, as you can see in the pictures, a parliament and a constitution. Soviet rule did come in between. So now, a further trope, throwing off the post-Soviet legacy. Ukraine became independent in 1991, but many things remained too post-Soviet. Hence this emphasis, otherwise surprising to many, in the Revolution of Dignity 2014, in getting rid of Soviet symbols as a way to getting rid of this post-Soviet stamp on society, economy, and politics. To be post-Soviet. Hence the decommunization laws of 2015 about renaming places and names. Really interesting studies have been done on the alternative names that were chosen. As you can see from this map of Ukraine, there's no clear pattern. Some new names have been commemorative. They refer to key events and individuals in Ukrainian history. But there's also the green, the topographical, and the light green, the poetic, right? It's rather more common in in southern and eastern Ukraine. A more eclectic, a more civic approach, putting together, second map, some periods of key Ukrainian history, Kyivan Rus, the Cossack era, the nationalist era of the 20th century, but also referring to more recent events like the Revolution of Dignity and the ongoing war itself. Parliament passed a resolution defining or enshrining the importance of the Maidan revolution in 2014 in a resolution in 2021. And look what it says. Article 3. Ukraine paid too high a price for freedom from dictatorship and its civilizational choice to be part of Europe. The heroes of the Heavenly 100, the 100 protesters odd who were killed, gave their lives during the Revolution of Dignity, defending the ideals of democracy, defending human rights and freedoms, and the European future of Ukraine. The memory of their heroic act is part of the history of national statehood. And then we go down to number 10. European values for which the heroes of the Heavenly 100 gave their lives are dignity, democracy, equality, and the rule of law, which are necessary for the normal functioning of society. So all of those tropes are there. Civic, civilizational choice, part of Europe, dignity, rights and freedom, all officially celebrated. As is the idea of European Ukraine. This map shows a Europe that stops on the Ukrainian eastern border. Beyond is Muscovy. This has also been encoded, not just in a legal measure, but in a constitutional change passed in 2019. The European identity of the Ukrainian people and the irreversibility of the European and Euro-Atlantic course of Ukraine. Lastly, I can highly recommend this excellent book by Onuch and Hale called The Zelensky Effect. So it's about Zelensky, elected in 2019. It looks at how many of these maturing tendencies have further developed in the same direction under Zelensky. So this figure from the book, figure 7.1, it says the Zelensky and war effects on identity and political dispositions in Ukraine, 2014 to 2022. So in the middle, start of Zelensky effect, you can see a vertical dotted line to when Zelensky was elected. So many things like support for democracy, desire to join NATO, the EU, were already on the rise, but rise further under Zelensky, precisely because Zelensky is able to recruit more Russian-speaking Ukrainians from southern and eastern Ukraine to supporting these values, because he is both a Russian speaker from the south. This graph shows some support for democracy among Ukrainians, going up and up, 41% to 76%, slight dip between May and July 22. But people see democracy as delivering for the likes of them. This shows civic duty, willingness to vote, to engage in political and or civil society activities, and to protest even, all at high levels and all on the rise. This now translates into determination to continue fighting the cause. The Ukrainian government should not make any compromise in negotiations, 83%. 82% agree, under no circumstances should Ukraine relinquish any of its territories, even if this prolongs the war and threatens its independence. So you have a much more united nation than in the early years after independence in 1991, united around these civic ideas, rejecting nostalgia for the Soviet rule. This graph shows Russia on the left and Ukraine on the right, starting in 2010, going up to 2021. So Russia and Ukraine start in similar places, but in Russia, nostalgia for the collapse of the Soviet Union, nostalgia for the Soviet Union, regret at the collapse, has been going up. With Ukraine, it's been going down, and sharply in recent years. You see, it's a consolidation to positive views of all of these figures in national history, three of whom, after Khmelnytsky and Hrushevsky, Khmelnytsky was a Cossack leader, Hrushevsky, historian and president of the Ukrainian People's Republic in 1917, they were always quite popular. Mazepa, rebellious Cossack, Stepan Bandera, nationalist, Simon Petliura, one of the other leaders of the 1917 to 21 Ukrainian state, but controversial for pogroms that his supporters committed. All of these now framed as part of a general ongoing struggle for Ukrainian independence, so all now viewed more positively than previously, including Mazepa, Petliura, and even Bandera. More people identifying as Ukrainian. This is already the case before the Revolution of Dignity and Russia's invasion. 1989, 73%, 2001, 78%. But look what the figure is now. This is in Ukrainian, but I've translated it for you. So in blue, 2017, 88% already identified as Ukrainian. 2022, now 95%. The numbers identifying as Rossiyska, Russian, red, only 2%, with a little number saying they're a bit both Ukrainian and Russian, mixed marriages or whatever. So 95% of the population now identify as Ukrainians. Putin, the great gatherer of the Russian world, has lost millions of people from that world through the process of re-identification. Even language is changing. Language use changes slowly if you have to learn another language. But this graph shows more and more people attempting to speak both languages. So blue is just Russian speaking at home, down from 37 to 15. The number speaking Ukrainian hasn't changed much, 41, up to 48, 51. But the key figure is the one in the middle, both Ukrainian and Russian, people trying to speak both, up from 21 to 33%. But whether they speak it or not, more and more people identify with Ukrainian as their native language, up to 80%. So to sum up, there was an image of Ukraine as a divided society 10, 20 years ago. This is now massively out of date. Ukraine is a consensus society with 80, 90% supporting the war, positively evaluating Zelensky as president, supporting membership in the EU and NATO, supporting democracy as the best form of government, and all of these other aspects of civic identity and society. Ukraine is a much more consolidated state and nation in 2022 than it was in 1991 or that it was in 2019 when Zelensky came to power. We've talked about the national idea. Often that's idealistic. Ideals of freedom and democracy aren't always delivered on. So next week we'll talk about how Ukrainian politics actually worked before Russia's invasion in February 2022.